The process of judging the 19th Nib Award has been unlike any other. There have been no committee meetings where everybody talks at once, no piles of books for everyone to wonder over, no generous plates of sandwiches catered by the council. At least there's been no need for the judges to stagger down to the car park carrying boxes full of weighty tomes. Instead, our reading has been delivered efficiently to our homes, where we have not dared to go outside. The volume of nominations has been slightly less than in previous years, mainly because there have been fewer self-published submissions, but the overall quality has been undiminished. Our shortlist could easily have been twice as long, so the judges had to make some hard choices while deciding the Alex Buzo Prize winners. There were accomplished books by writers who have appeared on our shortlist previously among this year's nominations, just as there were equally impressive works by writers hitherto unheard of. The list we have ended up with represents the variety of approaches and topics that could be seen among all of this year's entries, including biography, fiction, memoir, popular science, sport, and art criticism. And every book we have shortlisted could have been, arguably, a worthy winner of the Nib. Some attentive followers of the Nib might notice that several books on this year's list echo the selections made in previous years. Whether this is a reflection on the taste of the judges or an indication of the spirit of the age is for someone else to decide. After the Count begins at a rowdy Friday night at the Ingleburn RSL. Davy Brown, an accomplished boxer who came from a family of professional fighters, was competing for an International Boxing Federation title against a featherweight from the Philippines when he was knocked out cold in the final round. He did not get up again, and a few days later he died in hospital. From such an opening, one might expect this book to be a straightforward polemic against the evils of a violent sport, but instead it is something much more complex. That is because Stephanie Convery herself, at the time of Davy's death, had been training to fight. Her description of the physical presence, choreography and grace of the sport, of the way it felt when a gloved fist hit square on its intended target, will sound a chord with anyone who has kicked a ball or swung a bat or a club successfully. The appeal of boxing and the satisfaction it gives to those who participate in it are weighed methodically in this beautifully written account against the mortal risks it necessarily involves. That flirtation with death, she concludes, is what makes boxing what it is. Yet she also argues persuasively and from her own experience of head injury that it should be possible to make the sport safer without destroying it entirely. A beached humpback whale on the coast near Perth became a public attraction. Rebecca Giggs was among the volunteers who tried to push it back to sea, only for the whale to strand itself again. The experience and the sheer physical presence of the whale awoke in her what seems to have been an endless curiosity, enough to set about researching everything that is known about the Earth's largest living creature. Fathoms is the result, an extraordinary book that is much more than a collection of facts. In telling the reader about the main food source for the whale, krill, of which there are many more on the planet than any other animal, the author's descriptive powers approach the vividness of poetry. Matchstick length, shrimp-like crustaceans, translucent and spotted with fire orange, like drips of heated glass. This section goes on to explain the place of krill in the planet's ecology, just as the place of whales is explained, but not only their place in ecology, but in human history, culture from Australian Aboriginal rock carvings and Jonah in the Bible to Herman Melville, E. Cummings and Heathcote Williams, economy and value to the community all over the world. Scientific facts about the biology and anatomy of whales are presented in such a way as to be readable by any layman, with a strong narrative force. And when the story arrives at the matter of whale song and its placements and nuances, the reader is addressed directly. Don't we know that form already, reader? Don't we call it a poem? We do, and what we call this book is nature writing of the highest order, akin to that of the Nib's first winner, Tim Lowe. The last two winners of the Nib, Nadia Wheatley and Helen Lewis, were the authors of personal memoirs touching on the effects of the Holocaust on their families. Both of them were interviewed at our presentation breakfast by Suzanne Leal, who, as the author of the novel Border Street, researched and set in roughly the same place and time as those memoirs, was uniquely qualified to discuss the subject. Now, in her third published novel, The Deceptions, our interviewer has returned to the research topic that continues to haunt her. In our assessment, Border Street was a more accomplished work of fiction than the Miles Franklin Award winner in the year it was published, Anna Funder's All That I Am, a book with a similar theme and structure, but without such an elegant prose style. The new Leal novel introduces a cast of characters, one chapter at a time. Czech immigrants in near present-day Sydney, connected by their experiences in Nazi-occupied Europe, as well as their descendants and connections in the contemporary world. A young Jewish woman in the ghetto who becomes an Auschwitz survivor, a former police guard, a legal secretary, and a female minister, all are linked by an intricate secret that could affect all their lives. Elements of that secret become apparent early in the piece, as the narrative momentum is carried forward not by the secret itself, but by the need to conceal it. In the process, this book faces some of the past century's greatest horrors in unflinching detail, while also showing how the lesser deceptions of peacetime life can be just as affecting. The layers of research in this novel, revealed in an extensive bibliography, are worn as lightly as the clothing described so meticulously in it. But the clever structure and the glass-clear literary style mean that the deceptions must be seen as a striking advance on the already impressive Border Street. Brendan Isles' group portrait of an exceptional artistic family, the Boyds, appeared on the shortlist of the very first Nib, before the Alex Buzo Prize had been introduced. Thus, it is perhaps fitting that she should at last receive that prize for another immaculately researched and highly readable group portrait. The group she has written about this time is not a family, but 4 individual female writers from more than a century ago, whose works and lives intersected. All 4 of these women had a powerful influence on the early development of Australia's literature. Barbara Bainton, Ethel Turner, Henry Handel Richardson and Nettie Palmer. Turner and Richardson were both born in the same year, and they even shared a first name. The latter's real name, after she was married, was Ethel Florence Lindsay Robertson. But they are otherwise linked by their differences, not their closeness. Turner having grown up in suburban Sydney after coming to Australia from England as a 10-year-old, while Richardson came from country Victoria before attending the Melbourne boarding school of the Getting of Wisdom. Turner and Bainton were friends, and Bainton had a connection with Martin Boyd from Niall's previous book, though Turner found the author of Bush Studies to be diabolically cruel in things she says about everyone. All of the first three knew Nettie Palmer, whose significance owes more to her work as a critic, with a lifelong aim of promoting Australian literature than to her attempts at creative writing. Her book about Richardson's writing had the distinction of being the first book-length study of an Australian author, and yet she only wrote it after being excluded as Richardson's biographer. She was excluded because Henry never liked Nettie, although she was much indebted to her. Her correspondence contained a comic but belittling account of dreary Nettie and her dull husband, forever wanting praise for his unreadable novels. Such details bring the Australian literary world in the first half of last century to life, while reminding us how little has changed about human nature. Yet it is striking how much of that literary world took place in Europe. As Bainton and Richardson lived in London, Turner was a frequent visitor there, while the Palmers lived in Spain. And all of this long before the invention of jet planes. 4 years ago, the nib went to Rachel Landers for her book Who Bombed the Hilton, an exhaustive account of the crime regarded as Australia's first terrorist attack. Could there possibly be more to be said about this subject? The Hilton bombing proves that there could. The prize-winning Landers book examined the case in painstaking detail from the point of view of the victims and the police investigators. Now, IMRE SALUSINSZKY, who bizarrely feels himself to be Evan Pederick's twin, has recounted many of the same details from the point of view of the self-confessed and convicted Hilton bomber. Pederick, the son of a West Australian Methodist minister, broke free from his cloying yet chilly upbringing to travel across Australia, ending up in Hobart, where he fell for the phony spirituality of a murderous sect derived from Hinduism, known as Ananda Marga. Just a year later, at a so-called retreat on the outskirts of Sydney, Tim Anderson, who is now a respected Sydney University lecturer, recruited the 22-year-old Pederick in a plot to assassinate India's Prime Minister Desai at the newly built Hilton Hotel. The bomb that Pederick constructed exploded only to kill 2 innocent rubbish collectors and a police officer. For more than a decade, no one was charged with the crime, and in that time, Pederick moved to Queensland, married and became a father of twins who worked as a valued Commonwealth public servant. Yet he lived with a lingering sense that there was something twisted and unredeemed inside him. Thus, he was moved to confess to his part in the bombing when Anderson was arrested and was sent to jail. Since serving his sentence, he has become an Anglican minister back in Perth, where his life began. This compelling and readable account puts a well-known story into an entirely fresh perspective, as the research and writing skills Salusinszky has acquired in a career as journalist, university teacher and political advisor receive their full expression. Among stark red ranges and clumps of spinifex, the stranger was Tony Oliver, a former art dealer and aspiring painter from Melbourne. He was a passenger in a Toyota Land Cruiser driving through the Kimberley as a result of a meeting 2 years earlier with a former stockman called Freddie Timms, a Gija man who had become one of the region's leading artists. Oliver's interest in Aboriginal art and its appeal in the international art market had been awoken while he ran galleries in Melbourne and Sydney, And then, after repeated trips to New York, as he arranged shows by contemporary American artists, he came to see what painting was: a chamber of echoes. To Oliver, there was an echo between the Kimberley artists and the mid-century Catalan Miro, and between the school of colour field painting that had driven to acclaim figureheads of late modernism like Mark Rothko. When the celebrated Aboriginal artist Rover Thomas was taken to the National Gallery in Canberra, he was shown a Rothko painting, to which he responded, "Who's that bugger that paints like me?" In the Kimberley, Oliver, who at first felt like an intruder, came to live and work among the artists and to ensure that they were marketed and paid as they should be. But The Stranger Artist is much more than an account of one man's part in the growth of a major art movement. It is a book about the meaning of art and its place in human culture, at the same time as being a condensed history of the treatment of Aboriginals, past and present, in Northern Australia. Perhaps more importantly, it is also a series of memorable portraits of the larger-than-life characters who have produced the striking images now hanging in boardrooms and galleries all around the world. Freddie Timms and Rover Thomas, Paddy Bedford and Rusty Peters, not to mention Chocolate Thomas and others, and an evocation of the landscapes and communities of places with names like Turkey Creek and Crocodile Hole. Quentin Sprague lived in the Kimberley more than a decade ago, and his well-written book, which will remind some readers of Nicholas Rothwell's Wings of the Kitehawk, shortlisted for the second edition of the Nib, is the product both of first-hand observation and of years of research.